So Stephen LeDrew holds a Ph.D. in sociology from York University. He is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and he was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at Uppsala University. His research interests include the politics of secularism, non-religious movements and cultures, and religion and science in public discourse. Stephen's many publications on atheism and the new atheism include Discovering Atheism, Heterogeneity in Trajectories to Atheist Identity and Activism, which is published in Sociology of Religion. And he is also the author of The Evolution of Atheism, The Politics of a Modern Movement, which explores the rise of the new atheism and its impact on organized secular activism in North America. Evelina Lundmark holds a Ph.D. in the Sociology of Religion from Uppsala University. Her research interests are in the areas of non-religion and secular studies, digital religion, gender studies, and critical theory. Her doctoral thesis, entitled This is the Face of Your Atheist, Performing Private Truths in Precarious Publics, explores how women U.S. atheists portray their personal identities and beliefs on YouTube. Evelina is currently a lecturer at Uppsala University and a research assistant for the Understanding Unbelief project. Evelina is co-author with Mia Lövheim of Gender, Religion, and Authority in Digital Media, published in the Journal for Communication Studies, and she is co-author with Stephen LeDrew of Unorganized Atheism and the Secular Movement, Reddit as a Site for Studying Lived Atheism, which is published in Social Compass and is the starting point for our discussion today. So Evelina, thank you for being with us, and Stephen, thank you for being with us, and I'll just turn things over to you now.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm not sure if Stephen is actually back yet, but I'll start then. So the start of this article that Stephen and I wrote together was my own project. So it was based on a study I did on Reddit. So I think in the article we don't introduce Reddit as much, but the study was done back in 2013, and then Reddit had around 731 million unique visitors, over 40 million posts, and around 4 million comments in total. And at the time, Our Atheism was one of the main forums of Reddit, which meant that everyone who joined Reddit would automatically be subscribed to that forum and thus see news from that forum. And Reddit is an interesting social media technology because it's very dependent on what forum you are on Reddit, on how moderated it is, because all forums are, or the vast majority of forums are set up by individual users, which means that whoever set it up decides what the rules are and how edited it is. And at the time of the study, the moderator for Our Atheism didn't care at all about the forum, so there was no moderation. So everything that was popular on Our Atheism was completely user-generated. So generated by users voting content up and down. And how Reddit works in just very shortly is that you post something that you find interesting, and then people comment on it and vote it up and down. And if many people vote it down, then it essentially disappears from the forum. And if many people vote it up, it stays there for a long time and then generates more and more comments. Yes. And so what I wanted to do with this particular study was to look at how more unorganized discourse on atheism, what it looked like, and what the focuses were, and what was like the different breakdowns. And when I did it, I used discourse analysis inspired by Laclau and Mouffe, So critical discourse analysis, looking at the way the discourse was structured, essentially. And I think just briefly, I looked at how what these discourses tended to sort of imply was a specific view of human nature, which influenced how other topics were approached. So how religion was approached, how religious people were approached, how this kind of tension that a lot of literature has found in atheism between rationality and irrationality, or rationality and religion. And I thought that that was based on a view of human being as essentially rational, and trying to fit in the occurrence of irrationality to make sense in that framework. So for example, they tended to view religious people as choosing to be irrational, or using it as an excuse to act badly or have amoral views, and tended to view religion as essentially and only a form of primitive science. And then, I don't know, is Stephen here yet?
Yep. Oh, wait. Hello?
Yes.
Okay,
Then maybe you can talk about where you came in.
Okay, yeah, sorry, my computer just crashed, so if I disappear again, you'll know what happened. So what were we doing?
Presenting the work.
Okay, and so what were you just talking about, Evelyn?
I was talking about Reddit, and then what my part of the study was before we decided to make it into an article.
Right, okay. So basically the idea, this article was kind of my idea after hearing Evelina present her research at a seminar. So it's really primarily Evelina's article. It's based on her research. The empirical component is really all hers. So the idea I had would be to take what she had done with her research on atheism on Reddit, and kind of mash it together with the research that I had done on secular movement or atheist movement, or whatever you want to call it, formal atheist organizations, and see what happens. So the idea was that we would present Evelina's research as a study of lived atheism, so kind of informal atheist culture, or whatever you want to call it. Again, terminology is always an issue, it's always in flux. And then to compare what she had found with, what I found in formal atheist organizations in terms of the discourse about religious people and what atheism is about, and what is the purpose, like what does it mean to be an atheist, and so on. So, so my idea was that it would give us a window into, from my perspective, how deeply the new atheism in particular, which is sort of where this all started. I mean, there were atheist organizations before this, but they kind of brought it to a new level. So how deeply their ideas have penetrated a broader public sphere, and had reached the world outside of formal atheist organizations. So Reddit being an example of that, which is not a formal atheist organization, but it's kind of maybe somewhere in between. So yeah, that was the rationale for the article. But it's primarily Evelina's work. So what I did, I mean, the heart of the article is her research and her findings, what she found about atheism on Reddit, and then I kind of bookended it with this discussion of the new atheism and the secular movement, and like a kind of comparison between these two spheres.
Okay, great, thank you. Evelina, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay, no worries. All right, so great, thank you. So we'll just, we'll move into some question and answers, and we'll start with Sarah.
Hey, hi, thanks you two. That was great, and I really enjoyed the article. So thanks for putting it out there. It's really some fascinating findings. My question is probably a bit more methodological. I'm into methods, and I was really fascinated by the sample that you guys had on Reddit and who was posting on Reddit. And I guess one of the things I was wondering as I was reading the article is, are these the same people that also end up being interviewed in organizations? Are the people who are active in non-religious organizations? Oh, I'm going to have to stop. My building's testing my fire alarm, so I'll keep the question for next. I'll mute myself and I'll come back later. Sorry about that, guys.
Well, I think it's difficult to tell because Reddit is such a kind of wild forum. There's no way to really tell who the people are who test. So one of the main foundational principles of Reddit is that everyone can be anonymous, so it doesn't track user data in the same way, and you don't need to give up any information when you join Reddit. You don't need an email address, or you didn't anyway back then. I don't actually know how it is now. However, I will say that a good portion of the comments commented on not having anyone to talk about these things with. So I would assume that there's probably an overlap between people who could join organizations, but there is a portion that either was not part of an organization or probably were quite young and didn't have like that opportunity yet.
Yeah, but my fire alarm is done testing now, so I can get back into it. Yeah, it's I was just wondering, like, there's this question about, how do we get to this kind of the silent majority of non-believers, if you want, right? Like surveys are telling us there's a lot out there, but the portion who actually are active in non-religious organizations is actually quite small by all kind of estimates we can get to at the moment. So I was wondering, yeah, if those who are active on Reddit are also the ones who are just active in general, including in non-religious organizations, or, if they're, like you say, if there's like yes, there's the ones who are active in all forms, non-religious formats, but also like a certain portion that are kind of the ones that we tend to miss when we do research with non-religious organizations. And the question is, are they similar? Are there kind of the findings that you have in the paper, are they similar for this kind of silent non-believer majority that is mostly indifferent and just not involved, or would we find different things, right? It's just kind of a larger question about studying non-religion. Yeah.
I would say that the people who at least were commenting back then were probably not representative of the larger portion of unbelievers that aren't like explicitly atheist. So because the purpose of the forum is atheism, and I think especially, maybe because it had like over 1 million users, right? But the vast majority of those people also don't comment. So I would say that the people who comment, which are the only people that I could study really, were atheists. And I think that it's also, I've known other people who've used Reddit as a way to get informants for interview studies. And I think another problem is that the people who use Reddit, especially the big forums, tend to be have a certain like they tend to be young men, young white men, young, like highly educated, libertarian. So you get the specific also subgroup of people. So I don't think it's representative necessarily of atheists or people who are just simply indifferent, but I do think it captures a certain atheist discourse that I do think exists both within and outside of atheist organizations.
All right, thank you. Okay, a question from Ryan. I don't know if I'm allowed to read this one.
You can read it if you really want, but I loved this, right? I mean, I was astonished when I got to that section that it popped up, and I was like, wow, okay, this is a sizable section of a paper about circle jerks. One, I love that you got it in, but two, was there any pushback on that? Like, did anybody give you a hard time about that?
No, not for getting it published. I mean, I've had people like comment on it when I presented it, obviously, but no. But it is like they use it a lot. Like it's the word that they use, and they use it all the time.
This is science. You got to report what you find.
That's great. Okay, I have another question, but I need to formulate it. So give me a few minutes. Well, maybe somebody else.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ryan. So question from Isabella. Do we know where the users come from? Are most of them American?
So it's very difficult to answer because there's no specific statistics for the forum that I looked at. But at the time, most Reddit users in general came from the US and North America. And the most places that are mentioned are in North America. And like political discussions tend to be like US politics. So I assume so, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we mentioned this in the paper that there's no way of knowing where these people are coming from, but you have a sense that, you know, a sizable majority are Americans based on what they're talking about and the way they're writing. You know, you can kind of get a sense that they're, this is where most of them are coming from.
Great. Okay, thank you, Isabella. So our second question from Ryan. To what extent do you think the findings are influenced by the fact that this is online data and people tend to be particularly caustic and overstated online in order to get attention? Inversely, if you were to sit down and chat with the individuals who are posting in our atheism, do you think they would be more nuanced in how they think about religion and religious people?
I think so. Part of the idea of the circle jerk is precisely this, that the users of our atheism reflected on the fact that it was very aggressive towards religious people and very critical towards religious people in a way that maybe wasn't helpful, or that was just for people getting. So another function of Reddit is you as a person can gather points and become more like valuable on Reddit. And you do that by generating like good content that many people upvote and comment on. And so part of that is saying like, or you're just doing this to have this effect. They call it karma. So to gather karma, and a lot of comments were about that. So I think there is, I think we also wrote about that in the article about how it's a way to release tension. And they also, some of them reflected on that it's like, this is the space where I can be this aggressive because I can't be that in my personal life with like my family and people around me. So on the one hand, I think that, but if we were to sit down and talk with those people, I don't know, because I think in a way that they also, if they were, that this was, if it is a space where you vent aggression, on some level you do actually think that way, or I don't know how I should formulate that.
I think if I can jump in, I think this is actually a point where you can compare what goes on in Reddit with like atheist groups, like formal atheist organizations, where you see similar things happening, where it tends to be the more aggressive voices that dominate discussions and that tend to drown out other voices, and there's a lot of tension within these groups because of that. But I think, and a lot of them will say things like, well, I say these things, I'm really critical about religion, and I'm even aggressive about it because this is a space where I feel safe from around other atheists, so I can say things I wouldn't say to my family, or I wouldn't say anywhere else. So there's a kind of liberating effect, I think, of being in these spaces, but it's always a point of contention. Like whether in Reddit or any other atheist sphere, there's always contention about this.
Okay, awesome, thank you. All right, and now we have a question from Hugo. Can you explain a little more about the concept of atheist cultures? What does this concept imply? Is there any conceptual relationship between this concept and that of new social movement, with which some authors have used to analyze new atheism?
Good question. What does atheist cultures mean? It's not intended to relate to the new social movements approach or literature in any way, I don't think. It was, I mean, we didn't really know what to call it, and I don't think we still really know what to call it. How do you know what exactly is this? We were talking about we're trying to get at something that is outside of formal organizations, that's like lived atheism or whatever, but it's still not like just your, you know, if you did a broad survey of a whole population, you find X many number of people are atheists. It's not that. It's like something where there are people who are motivated to act and engage with each other based on their atheism or feelings about religion somewhere. So what exactly that means, how you define that, I'm not quite sure, but it's that, I guess, people who are active in some way, motivated to act and engage with other atheists for some reason. So spaces where this culture emerges, where there are people who have this common identity and these common beliefs, who get together and talk about religion or whatever else it is that they're talking about. But it's not a very precisely defined term. I don't know if Evelina has anything to add. No?
I guess I could add that, so in the research I did for my PhD was looking at another social media platform. I was looking at women atheists on YouTube. And that was quite a different type of discourse from the one on Reddit. So still holding, many of them holding quite a strong atheist identity, but emphasizing more so respect for religious people, and emphasizing that you could maintain social relationship with the religious people, and urging their audiences to accept them and that they would accept them back, and those kinds of things. So I think it depends on, yeah, I don't know if that was clear, but I think there are different strands. So if we focus only on the sort of new atheists that have a very clear discourse, like a clear culture that's very influential, it obviously influences a lot of atheists, but there are different ways that atheists approach that, different ways. So on the Reddit discussions, because it also is a platform that appeals to a particular type of person, we see a lot of similarities with the new atheist discourse, but looking at YouTube and these women on YouTube, there aren't a lot of similarities. So I don't know if that clarified anything.
Okay, awesome, thank you. All right, and another comment from Ryan. So I want to push a little on scientism. Part of the definition in the paper was, the only sort of knowledge we have is the scientific kind of knowledge. This concept is generally used in a pejorative fashion. Those who adhere to scientism are flawed in some fashion. I'm wondering what other sources of knowledge would be, and whether scientism is a spectrum or an either-or classification.
Well, I mean, in the way that, in terms of the new atheism, I think it is an either-or classification. Like, they have a very unnuanced, kind of stark understanding of what constitutes legitimate knowledge. If it's not produced by the scientific method, then it's not legitimate, and even more narrowly, if it's not produced or grounded in the natural sciences, then it's not really legitimate. So they have like no interest in social sciences, sociology, anthropology, religious studies. They have no interest in any of this. Think it's completely useless because you can explain everything with genetics and neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. So in that sense, it is a very narrow definition. In terms of, you know, it's used in a pejorative sense, I guess, yes, it is. It's used in it. I mean, it's used, the concept is applied critically in this context because we're talking about a group of people, a set of ideas. When I say group of people, I mean, I'm not talking about the broader atheist movement, but, you know, the major leading figures. It is applied critically in relation to them and their ideas because, you know, from my perspective, this is simply and clearly wrong. That the idea that you can understand everything you need to understand about human behavior and culture by drawing selectively on concepts derived from Darwinism. So in that sense, it is used pejoratively. What would constitute other kinds of knowledge? It would be, so when the way we define scientism in the paper, I think, is that it's specifically about, in this context, it's about the natural sciences, the inherent superiority of the natural sciences. Even more narrowly, like evolution is providing some kind of narrow master narrative that you can apply to virtually anything, to understand anything. So in that sense, yeah, it is, I don't know about pejorative, but it is a critical concept. I don't know, Ryan, if that satisfies you, if you have anything else to...
Yeah, no, I appreciate the discussion on that. I guess part of my thinking on whether this would be a spectrum too might add an additional component, right? So would somebody be still classified as kind of engaging in scientism if they accepted broader forms of, let's say, science knowledge, right? So let's say that they accept anthropology and sociology and psychology and religious studies, other things. Would they still fall on the spectrum of scientism? I'm sorry, my wife's talking in the background if you can hear. But so I'm wondering if that is a spectrum, right? I fully get what you're saying when you say that it's rooted in the natural sciences. I think that is problematic, and I appreciate the critical perspective there. But if you took a broader approach to science, would you still fall on a spectrum of scientism, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I suppose you would. I mean, I guess you could think of it as a spectrum. In this context, it means something very narrow and very specific. But you could think of it as a spectrum, right? In that sense, then you could say, well, okay, you accept the social sciences as also producing legitimate knowledge, but then what about philosophy, and what about religion, and what about experience, or whatever? Those could produce other kinds of knowledge, or experience could produce other ways of understanding. So maybe you could understand it, but that, I mean, that question wouldn't really matter so much in this context, because we're talking about people who have a very specific and very narrow definition of what constitutes legitimate knowledge.
If I can just add to that, I think the way I've seen this specific term used, scientism, is to explain this very narrow view of what science is, what the scientific method is, and how you can apply it to everything. So like an empirical example I saw on YouTube, where some commenters were discussing rape accusations against a famous person. And then one of them said, innocent until proven guilty. And then they used this Russell's teapot argument about you can't prove a negative. But I mean, in the case of a rape accusations, you can maybe prove a negative, because you can prove that someone wasn't in one place by proving it. Like it's not as easy to apply those kind of logical arguments that they use to disprove the existence of God on everything else. But that's sort of the approach that the term of scientism is trying to, I think, capture, is the way in which their approach to disproving the existence of God is sort of applied on everything, and the very narrow approach to the natural sciences as the only way to explain anything, or the only way where anything is even interesting to talk about, almost. Does that, Stephen, do you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Ryan, for that. So next question from Luma. So while analyzing the comments on Reddit, was there more tension between the users of r atheism and a specific religion?
Yes. So this is another reason why I assume that the majority of users were from the US. So the main tension was with Christianity, and with fundamental forms of Christianity, focusing on things like if evolution should be taught in schools and things like that, and focusing on creationism and those kinds of arguments. So yes, Christianity was the main focus. There was also mentions of Islam, but not in any detail. So all of the more detailed discussions was about Christianity, or religious people in sort of nebulous sense.
All right, great. Okay, thank you, Luna. Okay, are there any more questions at this point, or any comments anyone would like to make? Okay. Oh, Sarah?
Yeah, so well, I'll kind of continue on the methods then. So like there's very few studies so far that kind of focus on social media data for the study of religion and non-religion. So this is a great example of it. And I kind of want to hear you guys talk about, you know, the advantages and pitfalls of using this type of data rather than, you know, maybe some of the more classic types like survey or interview data that we tend to use in the field, and where, you know, what you'd recommend for people who want to kind of pursue looking at kind of public social media data in this sense, and where do you think the study of this type of data is headed?
Well, I think the most obvious pitfalls is about how to, so Reddit, for instance, you can tell the gender or even like anything like that. You can tell any sort of, what is the word in English? Any sort of data on age or location or anything like that. So it becomes very decontextualized, even though you can tell from the discussions that there are localized discussions, that like they are talking about people in their everyday life and referring to things that happen at school. And so it's clearly not a decontextualized experience, but it is for the researcher. And even in other social media like YouTube, it's also very difficult to determine the same things about commenters on YouTube, because even if those things are registered by YouTube, they're not accessible to researchers. So I think those things are very difficult to capture. I think it's also difficult to know if who you're getting, because you're obviously getting people who are engaged with it specifically, but you're only getting people who are very pro or very against. You're getting like the sort of extreme ends, because those are the people that tend to engage, obviously. So that's another thing to consider. And I think it can be very difficult to find good ways of capturing the data. So there are like always new sort of methods developing for how to get data from social media, but then you're sort of working against social media platforms that are sort of trying to make you not be able to get data. So before it was quite easy, for example, to download data off of Facebook, but now it's not possible anymore to download comments and stuff like that. But I think there are some very, there could be some very interesting studies. So I was part of like a digital methods summer school where we did a study on the alt-right movement in Europe. And then we also did a study on Reddit, where they basically downloaded all of Reddit and they ran like a word find. So a specific list of words they were interested in and how they were related to other words, and to get these kind of word clouds and how it developed over time and stuff like that. And I think that could be also interesting to do with atheism and non-religion on Reddit, because there are other forums. This was just the biggest one, but it also means that it was the most contentious one. So there were smaller forums where the debate was more friendly or more focused on other things. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
I think in general, I mean, you know, I don't think we'd be having this conversation if it wasn't for the internet. Like, this phenomenon has really become what it is. I mean, you know, it's not a coincidence that it's in the internet age that this new subfield of non-religion and atheism studies has emerged, because, you know, you talk to people, both members of, you know, formal organizations and people who aren't, they will almost always say, I discovered these ideas on the internet. I understood that there were other people like me out there because of the internet. So I think we're only having, so it isn't, I think, important to, I think there are a lot of methodological limitations, obviously. terms of representativeness and all of that. But I think it's really important to engage more with the internet and social media and the various atheist cultures, as we call it, that are out there, because this is where this phenomenon has really come to life.
Do we know anybody who, just thinking of social media and the social media out there, and you've discussed some of them, but what occurs to me, especially with the whole sliding scale of what counts as non-religion, atheism, religion, and things like that, whether there's anybody around who is doing similar research on the Chinese social media, like WeChat or something like that. Because, you know, given that Reddit is, as you've noticed, is somewhat heavily dominated by Americans, as is Twitter for that matter, then it interests me to know what kind of parallel discussions, if there are any, and kind of social media nodes there are in these other networks of social media, because, you know, the Western-based ones aren't the only ones around, and not the only ones having an influence. Just a thought.
Yeah,
No
not
idea.
that I know. Yeah, not that I know. I haven't heard of anything like that. No.
Okay, all right, thank you, Peter. Well, Charlotte has a question as well. Did you have any issues getting ethical clearance to use data from Reddit/YouTube? I'm using Facebook to recruit participants for my PhD research, but had to really work hard to get my university to let me do it. Did you find anything similar?
I didn't. I mean, we have you have to go through the ethical review board, and it takes quite a long time. But I didn't have any problems specifically. But I argued for all the data I looked at was publicly available, and posted on public platforms, and I didn't do anything that would require you to have, so Facebook requires you to log into Facebook to see the data on Facebook, right? But the things that I looked at on YouTube and the things I looked at on Reddit, you don't need to sign up to those sites to look at it. It's completely publicly available, and that's how I argued it.
I actually used Facebook in my when I was doing my PhD. I used Facebook to recruit participants. I did my PhD at York University in Toronto. I don't know where you are, Charlotte, but I didn't have any issues. I used Facebook to contact organizations and ask them to forward requests, my requests for participants to their members and whatnot, and which was really useful. I'm not even sure how I would have done it otherwise. It wouldn't have been as successful as it was if I hadn't. If Facebook didn't exist. So I didn't have any issues. I don't know if anybody noticed it. I just passed over, but nobody asked any questions or mentioned it at all.
Charlotte, I think you're probably dealing here with the arbitrary unevenness of research ethics culture. Because, I mean, I've been using Facebook to recruit people specifically for years. In fact, doing it right now, right? But having been involved in research ethics culture, you know, on the boards and stuff like that, one discovers very, very quickly that it matters a great deal where you are. And if you just happen to have an ethics board that is sticky, then you have trouble. But, you know, the university down the street may have a different ethics board, and they won't give you any trouble for the similar kind of thing. So I'm not surprised that Evelina and Stephen did not have problems. I think that that's more normal. I'm more surprised that Charlotte has had problems, and almost like, you know, what university are you at that has such a sticky REB?
Can I just jump in there, just to add to that? Yeah, like Canadian ethics boards in general are known to be a bit more strict, or a lot more strict than European or US ethics boards on these issues. And yeah, it can vary between university to university. For example, on Reddit, if you don't have to log in to see the online content, or say like YouTube or that, our university doesn't actually require ethics clearance for that. It's just content analysis of publicly available data, right? It's not gathering new data from human participants. But there's like a fine line there. Like if you do have to log in to see it, then you suddenly need ethics clearance. And you know, it can, because this is also relatively new, like, you know, it's only appeared in the last 10, 15 years or so. There's still like committees are still kind of debating on where that line is and what's required. So I think, and you know, these ethics boards, it's just learning how to sell it to them as well, right? That comes with experience of like the right words to say, how to say it, and that's something you just learn often in grad school. But yeah, so don't give up. I'm sure you'll be able to get it. It's just kind of a lot of back and forth sometimes with the ethics committees. It can be quite frustrating.
So would it be like if you were using Facebook for your research, not collecting data from Facebook, but just trying to recruit participants, would it be the same issue?
Well, now Facebook data is mostly private, right? Like that's that kind of shift that you're talking about. Like it used to be public, but now it's mostly shifted to like privacy settings, right? That only friends can see it and stuff. And so it's usually that does now require ethics clearance. But again, it's like, it's a bit fuzzy sometimes. But like say Reddit, you can still just see online, or YouTube that you can still just watch without logging in, or anything that's just public. Then it's just like website content analysis that you don't, there's some types of data collection you don't need ethics clearance for, like analyzing existing survey data that's done for the most part, or kind of that public, or going and observing public spaces. It's only when you're actually collecting new data from human beings and entering into contact with them that you need that ethics clearance. Obviously that line, where that line is, depends on the university. And when Facebook kind of made that more privacy switch to kind of your friends can only see your content now, I think that's when it kind of, for us at least, that's when you needed the ethics clearance. That's when it came in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Charlotte, for that question. Ted is asking, looking at the front page of r/atheism now, it looks like there's a number of posts which are news stories about specific conflicts between religion and law, or religion and government funding. Was it similar at the time of this analysis, or has the culture there changed?
So it actually changed quite a bit, and it changed, I think, about 2 years after I did the study. So what happened was that the original moderator for r/atheism was ousted, and new moderators were put in place, and they changed the rules and started moderating quite heavily to affect more of a discussion climate. That was like what they wanted. So they wanted to move away from what it used to be, which was a lot of memes, a lot of images, and like short videos, and more jokes, which was at the time of the study. There were news stories back then as well, but not as heavily, you know. So it changed quite a bit because of the moderators changing.
Okay, thank you, Ted, for your question. Are there any other questions or comments right now? Okay. So something I was wondering, Evelina, I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit more. I know you touched on this, but maybe some similarities or differences between your research on YouTube versus Reddit, because I was looking quickly at your PhD thesis in preparation for today, and I think the gender aspect in particular really captured my attention. So I was wondering if that you could elaborate maybe a bit more, if that came up at all on Reddit, or if there were any differences that really surprised you.
So one of the difficult things, of course, on Reddit is that I couldn't tell if it was a gender aspect a lot of the times. However, in discussions where someone mentioned that they were a woman, people would comment and say, you only mentioned that you were a woman, so you would get like points in the discussion. So you would win the discussion as if it was like a bonus to be a woman in a discussion. So that was interesting. So, but on YouTube, of course, I looked at women and gender binary, non-binary people, and they both the majority of them had a quite different approach than the approach that wasn't our atheism, and their focus was quite different. So I think even now, I think there's like a difference between focusing on how bad religion is and how to convince people not to be religious, and how to argue convincingly for the fact that religion is irrational, contra what I more found so on YouTube, which was more trying to foster understanding and not really needing to have a discussion about why you were an atheist or why you didn't like religion or whatever. And when receiving those kinds of questions from commenters, it would be more so like, yeah, but I don't want to answer these things. Like, I don't have an interest in discussing if the world was created by God or if it was evolution. I don't like, I understand you think that and I think that, and that's fine, but I don't really want to talk about it, as opposed to what I found on Reddit, which was really diving into those creationist arguments and trying to disprove them, to have something to say when you were faced with a creationist. So I do think, I think it could be a gendered aspect, but I only looked at women, of course, on YouTube. But then again, some of the most popular atheist YouTubers that are men are also like more in the realm of the Reddit atheists that I looked at. Yeah, so I think it's also like not feeling included in a discussion that's like so aggressive and always needing to be aggressive and wanting to have a different type of conversation. And also, again, emphasizing that like you can keep your religious friends, you don't have to lose those friends. You can maintain relations with your family. Like it doesn't need to be this big thing where you leave everything just because you have this particular point of view.
Great, thank you for that. It's really interesting. Are there any questions right now? Or does everyone just want to hear me keep talking? All right, that's okay, I'll keep going. Feel free to cut me off at any point. But this has been really interesting for me in particular. I was just thinking, I run the Instagram for the Nonreligion and Complex Future project. And Instagram is much more visual and kind of image heavy as opposed to text heavy. But of course, when I post these images on our account, I do like hashtag atheism, hashtag nonreligion. So I'm getting all these like atheist individuals. Another term I see a lot now is free thinker, who are following us and liking our images. So it's been interesting too to see not just, I think, so much like the written component that you would see more on like Reddit or things like Twitter, but also like visually, like what are these groups and individuals sharing? What kind of like symbols and images are they using? Have either of you thought about that at all? Perhaps like the more visual side to social media? And I guess on YouTube, you get it a little bit more too with videos because you're not just presenting your thoughts, but like yourself visually as well. So yeah, I'm just wondering if either of you have thought about that at all, or have seen anything regarding that.
Yeah, I mean, of course I thought about it, but I think it's also interesting because the videos I looked at weren't, they weren't necessarily made to be like aesthetically pleasing in a way that a lot of content on Instagram is, for instance. So it was more so very direct, like sitting in front of a webcam on your living room floor or your bedroom floor or something and talking. So it was more about that, I think, like immediacy of connecting with another person rather than like focusing on the aesthetics of the image or like how you want to represent something. But I do think like that's also maybe part of the difference in content on YouTube, which is a website that's more so focused on connecting in a different way than Reddit, which is more focusing on having discussions. But yeah, I think it's very interesting with Instagram and yeah, I mean, I've thought about it, but I don't have anything intelligent to say.
Okay, great, thank you for your thoughts. All right, does anyone else have a question or comment? Ryan asked all of his, so I'm asking someone besides Ryan. Does anyone else have a question or comment before we start to wrap up? All right, so maybe Steve and Evelina, I'll just ask you if either of you have any final thoughts or comments you'd like to share with us based off of questions or discussions, or anything else you'd like to share with us before we start wrapping up.
What do you think? Do you have any final concluding thoughts, Evelina?
No, I think I've had all my thoughts.
You've had all your thoughts. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, we did present this article as, there's Evelina's research, which is, a fixed piece of research, and then some of the rest of it was a little bit speculative. So I think what we were trying to do, or my idea was more that I was kind of trying to raise questions about how do you connect these, so this is maybe a methodological question, like how do you connect research, like Sarah, you pointed to this, right? Like, this broad survey-based research and qualitative interview research with members of atheist groups and, the atheist cultures that emerge online or whatever. How do you connect these things? What kind of, how can we understand this conceptually? How do you understand, how do we define these things? So it was kind of to raise these, the point was to raise questions that we didn't really have answers to. So the idea was to just kind of generate some questions and some thinking on these issues. So we don't really have I don't have a lot more conclusions. Mostly what I had in the article were questions.
I also think that another interesting methodological issue is when looking at if research, non-religious research only focuses on atheism, or if it should include more indifferent people, and how do you find those people? But so in the Understanding Unbelief project, which I'm working now with the qualitative interview data, I think when you, in those cases where you find someone who is truly indifferent, they also don't really have any thoughts about it. So they haven't thought about any of these things. And so they're quite taken aback by these kinds of questions, and they can't really formulate an answer. So it's also difficult, even if you locate the truly indifferent, to get any clear data, because they just don't tend to think about those issues. Whereas if you interview people who are interested, or if you find something like on social media with people who are either agnostic or atheist or some type of non-religious, but they're outspoken about it, they've usually thought about it more. So then you actually get something to study. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think it's also a case for looking at these types of social media where people are actually active, because they have something to say about it, even if you only get a small portion of them. It's also very difficult, even when you find the truly indifferent people, to get their reflections, because they just don't think about it.
All right, great. Thank you for that. All right, so is there any, just in case, any final question or comment before we close up? All right, so Luma is asking, in the paper you said that while claiming to be proponents of free thinking and open inquiry, the new atheist's ideological commitment to scientism is actually a disingenuous form of closed-mindedness. Was there any comments about that? If yes, how the users react to also being criticized?
So I'm not sure I understand comments about that from who, and the reactions from users. So which reactions or which users are we talking about here?
Yeah. Luma, can you just clarify what reactions you're talking about?
Hi, what I mean is that if during your analysis on Reddit, if there was any comments or post with like critics also to the atheist movement or the lived atheism? And if yes, how was the reaction and the response to those comments online? I don't know if I was clear enough.
So you mean if they received any kind of critics during the time of the study and how they reacted? No, there wasn't any specific post like that, but there was some pushback from people in the comments. There weren't a lot, but there was some, for example, people who self-identified as religious or believers in some sense that went in and tried to nuance the discussion, but that was always a lot of pushback against that. So they didn't really, there was no sense that they would listen to those kinds of attempts at nuancing or attempts at critique. So they were quite clear in that if you're a religious person and you're a moderately religious person, you're just simply not religious, and you just need to realize that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you, Luma, for your questions today. All right, so this brings us to the end of the session. So I'll just say one thank you to all our participants today for being here and asking your questions and comments. And then a final big thank you to Evelina and Stephen for both being here, taking time out of your day to join us and sharing all of your insights and knowledge with us. This was a really excellent session, so thank you both.
Thank you.